Hi everyone, welcome to the observation protocol creation video. So I want to start out by asking you about 4 different kinds of observation. And sorry about the font, I don't know what's going on here, but the font is fine on my PowerPoint slides. So a complete participant is a researcher who is also completely involved in the activity being studied. So like a teacher who is self-observing, for example. A participant observer is the researcher is observing and interacting, but is not, isn't like, that's their job or something like that. An observer participant, the researcher is observing, but not really interacting. And a complete observer is usually behind a mirror where the participants don't even know the person is present. In educational research, we often take a participant observer approach because the belief, my belief anyway, is that number one, people will know you're there anyway. So you might as well just be present completely. Number two, unless you're studying some sort of experimental intervention, especially if you're in a classroom, it's kind of ridiculous to just step back and not do anything when students need help or when things are going on in the classroom. So you kind of balance those roles and you think about exactly what you're trying to find out and to what extent you want to participate. So one of the things to think about is, what are you going to be observing? There's several things, several ways to approach this. One is you could observe a specific activity or set of activities which is very bounded, like an observation of a lesson or a professional development setting or a board meeting. In this case, it's nice. It's sort of like a mini case within your sets of observations. Another way to approach it is shadowing someone or a ride-along. So you can shadow a student, for example, and attend all classes with that student, observing the kinds of interactions that happen based on your research question. Or you could spend a week, not for your pilot study, with a district superintendent and see what kinds of issues come up, again, based on your research question. And finally, there's general ethnographic observation. You likely will not be doing this for your pilot study, although you could begin an ethnographic observation set. It would be something like spending several days a week for an entire semester at a school, where you're really trying to, and this is very much a participant observer role, you're really trying to understand the general culture of what's going on in that classroom or school. So one of the most difficult aspects of doing an observation is how overwhelming it is to be in any given context trying to take notes. Now, you can sometimes record a conversation or a dialogue or something like that while you're taking notes, and then you have 2 sources of data, as long as you ask your participants first. But I want to focus for a moment on taking notes. What in the world do you write down is the real question. This has a lot to do with your research question and your general focus. But I'm going to give a couple of examples. So first of all, if you're doing general ethnographic observations, you write down almost everything. I am going to move on that because you all have specific research questions that you'll be observing for. For example, how does a new teacher enact her pre-service learning, emphasizing inquiry and social justice? This is a very nice, direct, and specific question. The observer role is probably a participant observer because they're in a classroom observing class activities. And for them to not talk to the students seems a little bit strange. It might be 1 unit of instruction. Of course, for your pilot study, it will probably be a little bit less. What would you focus on in your observations? Well, go back to the research question. This question is asking about inquiry and social justice being enacted in the classroom. So you might be focused on their teaching practices. You might have in mind what are inquiry-based and social justice-based teaching practices, maybe culturally relevant pedagogy. You might be looking at the way student interactions are fostered that develop equity and social justice among students. And so over the course of time, what you take notes on is evidence of aspects of these kinds of teaching. In another example, how does being designated a low-performing school affect an urban principal's day-to-day activities? Probably this would not be as much of a bounded observation. You might be shadowing the principal, again for the pilot study, maybe just for a day. And you would be focusing on the decisions, interactions, and activities that the principal takes part in that relate to anything around testing or sanctions regarding testing. The next little bit of this presentation, I'll talk about the kinds of notes that you might want to take. In doing ethnography, like I mentioned before, you might take free form or field notes, trying to write down everything you see and hear. Again, for your pilot study, I do not recommend doing this approach to note-taking. Another way to do it is scripting or writing a running record, which is essentially writing down everything you see and hear, but based on your research question. So there will be things going on that are not related, quite obviously, to your research question. And those are the things that you can opt not to write down because you will, of course, be scribbling madly. When you are writing down everything you see and hear, it is extremely important to avoid interpretation. And I'll give you some examples soon. But you can have an interpretive column. So you can have your notes on one side and then a column on the other side where you interpret what's going on so that you can give your judgment to what you see happening in a separate column. So Blackboard will not let me, as far as I know, embed a YouTube video, but if you can copy and paste this YouTube video into your browser and just watch the first few minutes of this teacher and her class, because I'm going to go over a couple of ways of thinking about this clip in terms of taking notes. So go ahead and do that before clicking to the next slide, which I will show you some example notes with interpretation. Okay, so first of all, if you were to divide your note-taking about this little video, you would definitely want to write down your actual data, the direct, what we call thick description of what's going on the left-hand side, and you would want to do it first. You want to simply record what is happening using neutral language. Your impressions can be recorded after your observation. In this case, what I'd recommend is using complete sentences or a narrative style. Your impressions may not be, they may be opinions, but they should always be based on and justified by the data. And I'm going to show you an example in the next slide. All right, so this is a set of observations on the first part of the video based on these research questions. Who exhibits voice in this classroom? Are there patterns of race, gender, or non-observable elements? What are the patterns and culture of classroom activities and interactions? What is ritualized and what continues to have meaning? So those are some of the guiding questions. So first, notice the observational notes and data, I tried to be as non-interpretive as possible. I say teen students are in a typical class setup. Teacher is walking around in the front by the whiteboard. Students are sitting at desks, except student desks appear to be in a circle. The board is not being used as a board, but instead has various papers. So I'm just describing, students are sitting in a circle, the teacher is walking around by the front. Over here, I give my impressions, and I really like to write these in the form of questions. I wonder if there is any student work or representation of students on the board or walls. Then over here I have teacher gives lesson objective, but it could be not in students' language. So I'm worried that this may not be in the language students might normally use, developing comprehension with 6 new strategies. And then I ask over here, is this ritualistic thing or is it integrated into the context of the lesson? Okay, so now student placed near the front of the class, I'm just calling him DJ here, raises a hand, waves it. I left mine at home. She gives him a paper. Again, this is just basic description. Over here, I could say something like, How is the student positioning himself in relation to class interactions and structures? Is he resisting or recasting his voice in some capacity? Is he just trying to participate? Is this a normal interaction pattern for him? How about the relationship between the white students and DJ, who's likely African American? Is there a positioning dynamic going on there as well? So I'm saying, hey, look, I'm noticing that there might be something going on here, but right now all I have is questions. I'm not making a judgment. The teacher says, please take out your pen and paper too while you are at it. So again, I'm trying to give as much direct quotes as possible as I can possibly write down. And note that I also note the time, and I do that throughout. DJ also does not have a pen and paper. Student loans it to him. The teacher reads from a text. Students appear to be listening. They are sitting, looking at their papers. So note here that I say they appear to be listening. Of course, I don't know if they're actually listening. And then I actually give evidence. They're sitting and looking at their papers. That's why I think they're listening, although that may not be true. They're also not interacting with each other than the interaction described below. I'm not sure if the students are reading as well. Okay, so I'm just sort of describing the situation. Now note here that I ask, are all students doing this? I can only see part of the students, so there may be students doing something else somewhere else. I also ask, what are the interactional opportunities within this text? So again, in my questions about equity, in what ways does it represent or not represent student experience? And then moving on, DJ tries to engage his neighbor by flicking paper. I give a time signature. And then the teacher comes over and puts her finger on DJ's shoulders. He looks up and then frowns down at his paper. Again, I am just trying to describe exactly what's going on. And then over here I ask, is this a classic pattern in this class? The students seem to have experience with it. And then I give a note to myself, attend to who reads and who has voice in this new pattern. All right. And based on these notes, my analysis, which I do later, could center on gender as an element of classroom interaction, on the way students view the teacher, on the way the teacher is positioning the students, on the use of classroom tools, or on race as an element of classroom interaction. Of course, I would want to have a lot more notes before trying to do such an analysis. And as a quick example of what we may be tempted to write down, but should try to avoid, are things like this. One student is irresponsible. The teacher is boring, reading from the text. Even if we are tempted to write this down in the interpretation section, I recommend writing it as a question and also continually being aware of the social and cultural structures and processes that produce the kinds of behaviors that you're seeing, and allowing that to guide the kinds of questioning processes that you go through when you think about the student being irresponsible or the teacher being boring. So what we just went over before was open-ended note-taking during observations. There are also observation protocols that are more codified. So for example, there's the Equip Science Instructional Observation Protocol, which I'll show you in a moment. There's also a Culturally Responsive Instructional Observation Protocol and a Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol, and well, very lots of them. I do not like these protocols nearly as much as open-ended notes, especially in the beginning of a study, like a pilot study. However, they can be useful for later quantitative comparing of classrooms, for example. So if you're going to be observing two different teachers over time and you want to compare how much they implement inquiry instruction. My experience with these protocols is that they do not often allow for the surfacing of the sociocultural processes that influence and guide the kinds of effects that you see in classroom instruction, or if you're observing a meeting, interaction between people and those kinds of things. But I will go over them in case you may need them. So you can have simple observation protocols. I often put these just at the top of my note paper if I want to tally mark different things happening in a class. So for example, I might be interested in, when does such and such happen? It's a very specific thing. So when does a student respond to a teacher's question? And maybe I'm interested in them reasoning with evidence or applying logic to problem solving when they do that. So I put a tally. When does a student say something in peer conversation in the lab, reasoning with evidence, applying logic for problem solving. When does a student say something in peer conversation in pair share, reasoning with evidence, applying logic to problem solving? This can give me a general sense of the patterns that are happening within a classroom. Another simple observation protocol, you can divide by categories of people, especially if you're looking at equity. So maybe you're looking at boys and girls interactions in the classroom, and you want to tally to when a boy asks a procedural question or a critical question, when a girl asks a procedural or critical question, and you can tally those in a table like this. In terms of gender interactions or any kind of equity-based tally like this, you may also be interested in looking at the way the teacher responds. So sort of like, when do boys speak? In what ways does the teacher respond to boys? When do girls speak? In what ways do the teachers respond to girls? And you can really start to see some patterns of inequity emerge when you do things like that. Now, in terms of the observation protocols that are in the literature, this is an example of a heavily scaffolded observation protocol. It essentially looks like a rubric. This is the EQUIP. This is for observing inquiry-based practices in a teacher's classroom. So you see pre-inquiry is level 1, teacher predominantly lectured to cover content, developing inquiry, level 2, frequently lectured, etc. Proficient inquiry, level 3, exemplary inquiry, level 4. And they have a description for each. And so you would be in the classroom circling where they fall on these rubrics. And so if you are interested, you can look up rubrics that are in your area that you're interested in. But again, I really caution against this way of observing, especially in the pilot study, because it does not allow you to understand everything that's going on in the classroom that may be important. There can be observation protocols that are a little bit less restrictive, but also guide you in what you're trying to look for. So if having super open-ended note-taking is just too much for you, you may want to consider an approach like this. Of course, and I want to point out, you always write down the date, you always write down what you're doing, the teacher, the date of the observation, the school, or whatever you need to write down, so these things are not forgotten, which they very much can be. So in this case, this is a observation protocol for formative assessment, teachers using formative assessment. So what this has is a number of categories going along the left-hand side. So formative assessment having to do with homework, having to do with board work, and so forth. And then in here on the across, there's this idea of individual feedback, group feedback, or teacher adjustments to instruction based on, sorry about the cat's tail, based on the formative assessment. So within these boxes, then you could write what you saw happen regarding individual feedback on homework, what you saw happen regarding group feedback on homework, what you saw happen in terms of teacher adjustments to their instruction based on homework. So it can be a little bit of guidance, and some people like that. Finally, I just want to make a point about avoiding evaluation. Unless your purpose is evaluating the classroom or the teacher, avoid ranking or rating what you see there. And again, occasionally you might use a rubric like the EQUIP rubric to, compare two classrooms in terms of inquiry use. But I just really recommend moving your ways of seeing. So I'm going to give you an example of that. I had a doctoral student a while back who is in nursing, who was taking ethnography, and she was going to observe nurses for, she was actually the supervisor of nurses. She was going to observe them for particular caring protocols in the room, in the patient's room. And she could not move away from an evaluative stance. She would go in and she would be like, look, they're not doing these caring protocols. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, I don't know what's going on, but they're just not doing it. And so I advised her to go in and write down what they were doing. And through this process of thick description of what they were doing, she realized that there were ways in which, number one, they were incorporating caring protocols into their interactions. But number two, that there were certain barriers internal and structural, for them to incorporate more. So she was, by opening that box up and moving away from are they doing it or not, she was able to really see the sociocultural context that was guiding her nurses, and then to support them in the kinds of shifts that help the patients. So that is the last slide. Essentially, what I hope to see from you if you're writing up an observation protocol is simply a plan. It does not have to be a codified boxed thing like we just talked about. It could be literally that you'd like to write down your observations on one side and your interpretations on the other. Maybe you draw up a table for that, but just a plan for how you plan on observing, what you'll be focusing on if you do an observation.